My people, I'm delighted to be here again. I'm honored that I'm asked to come back. If you've heard me speak before, you know that the motto at the Pew Research Center is, "Any day spent with a librarian is a better day." We've been doing this now coming up to 20 years. And some of the primary stakeholders of our research are librarians, and the appreciation you show and the depth of understanding that you bring to some of the data that we gather is just amazing and wonderful on our behalf. We actually call ourselves a fact tank, not a think tank, because we're in a different line of work from think tanks. Think tanks are populated by people who see economic, social problems and then come up with solutions for them and advocate very aggressively for those solutions. We aren't in the solutions business. I would be fired if I expressed my personal opinion anywhere. That's how scrupulous we are in sort of saying, here are the data, and you guys make of it what you will. So it's wonderful that we generate data that is continually interesting to you. That being said, there's a cool nerd factor being associated with the Pew Research Center. We are parodied with some regularity on The Onion. And this, one of my, if you go to The Onion and use the search tool and stick in Pew Research, you'll see a whole bunch of stuff that makes reference to us. This is one of my favorite recent ones. 90% of Americans strongly opposed to each other. The vast majority of respondents signaled they were dead set against the U.S. populace, condemning in forceful terms the way others have handled things over the past year, said Pew Research Center polling analyst Babette Randolph, who is not a real person, noting that the rate of opposition remained consistent across all 50 states and virtually every demographic, regardless of age, gender, race, religion, or political identification. So, and another feature on The Onion you might recall is they have people on the street interviews and stuff. So after this came out, it said, "Wow, I can't believe I'm included in Pew findings." And then another person said after that, "Yeah, but Pew's a bunch of stoners." So I don't know. I'm not going to fess up to my past, but what the heck. Since the onset of the 2016 election, so starting really in 2015, we obviously began to pay a lot of attention to the cultural stresses that were going on related to, especially to information and how information was processed and used by people, and misinformation and fake news and all that kind of stuff. And we've now sort of doubled and even tripled down on work that we've been doing for a long time on these related issues. But we've now bracketed them as a special sort of branch of our work product that we call Trust, Facts, and Democracy. We believe that there's an interplay among those three things. And as I was thinking about our work in the context of librarians, you guys, all right, the billboard votes against me. Thank you so much, and yeah. Yeah. At least it keeps her from having to keep up with my New York speed of talking. So maybe that was a little break. And as I've thought about our library work, you guys intersect so vividly and so importantly with all the dimensions that we are studying. It was really easy to integrate our insights into your world into this branch of our work that we're calling Trust, Facts, and Democracy. So here I'm going to break them apart into three areas, and I come bearing data, as I always do. I find that the fact that I can say a bunch of statistics and show slides with statistics gives you the false impression that I have wisdom. It's just that I know kind of things and in ways that maybe you don't ever do, but I'm not really a repository of wisdom, but I do know a lot of data. This is the sort of starting slide in almost everybody's presentation related to trust, and it's our standard question, just like a lot of polling organizations ask questions about, do you trust various institutions to do the right thing most of the time? And our data are that over time, since the late 50s, it is the basic trust that people have in their government. The broad question, you trust your government, has collapsed. The most recent reading we got was in 2017, and 19% of Americans said just about always or most of the time. So less than a fifth of Americans now say they trust the government to do that. A lot of people said only some of the time or hardly ever. We also asked questions related to trust in the media, and we don't have such a long timeline on it, but these data were really striking when we gathered them even before the 2016 election. We essentially, there's a lot of going on in that slide, but the two main takeaways are that conservatives go to one side, have their preferred data sources, and liberals have a different batch of data sources. And when we ask the trust question, it scatters exactly the way you would expect it, as people are now going to sources that are inflected, in their view, with partisanship and are either on their team or are not on their team. Again, really dense slide. The only thing to note here is the mosaic pattern in the slide, that there are some media organizations that are deeply trusted by the center-left, and there are other organizations that are trusted by the center-right. And so, at least in their preferences, there's crossover. Liberals watch Fox News, conservatives watch CNN and consume other mass media from the center. But the trust in the place that they prefer to go and the place that they rely on for information has now balkanized. And it's really interesting now. It's not relevant to ask the broad question, or do you trust the media, nearly as much as it's important to unpack it and ask people about specific media properties and the sort of, especially the partisan inflection that people impute to them. When we show this slide to mainstream traditional journalists, they are pretty strongly objecting to it. They say we are not partisan. We're trying to tell both sides of the story or multiple sides of the story. We try to be balanced in either direction. But the fact of the matter is that in the past 5 or 6 or 7 years, the center and the left the audiences have certainly changed for those media properties. And in fact, that's the case with our own audience at the Pew Research Center. We don't want to be seen as alien or in opposition to certain groups, but the center-left audiences are a little bit more prominent in consuming our content than others. It's just a fact of life now that this is the lens through which people judge information. And it's particularly important, and I'm sure you guys see it in your own lives. The other thing that's happened related to trust is that people now are watching how information is conveyed in conversation and in other places, and particularly as it's mediated through social media, people think that bad things happen on social media. There are sort of social norms that are broken, and there are ways in which people's interactions on social media are much more toxic than they are in face-to-face conversations. So we asked people in the 2016 election, compared with conversations, face-to-face conversations you have with people, how do your conversations on social media work out? And here's what we got. They're much less respectful, much less likely to come to a resolution, much less civil, much less focused on policy debates, and much more sort of ad hominem and personal in their character. They are much less sort of politically correct, and they are much less informative. But we got a lot of resounding affirmation that they're much more angry than they are in person-to-person conversations. There's a lot of other experimental work, not that we've done, but other researchers have done, that has well documented the phenomenon that people will do things on a computer in the privacy of their office or of their home or wherever they are that they would never do in face-to-face encounters with people. There's a disinhibition that goes with that. You can watch mobs building up, and people want to join the mobs and things like that. So social media brings an especially sort of toxic flavor to information exchanges in the judgment of a lot of our respondents. The other thing that's affected the tone of information exchange, particularly online information, is that harassment is a big part of the picture now. It's not a bug of the online environment, it's a feature of the online environment. 41% of American adults have themselves been victims of harassment online, and 66% have watched it unfold online. Now, as you notice some of the categories that we asked about here as we unpack the idea, some of the things we asked about, we got pushback from people sort of saying, this isn't harassment. If you call people names, why should that be scored as a harassment activity? Other people think that depending on the tone of it and the circumstances of it and the way that it unfolds, that is harassment. So we included a list of activities that range from relatively common and not necessarily deeply threatening to the deeply threatening. And we got 18%, so about a fifth of people said that the really bad stuff had happened to them. And young women in particular were more likely to say that all of the sort of menacing, harassing, threatening, stalking elements of this were occurring to them than anyone else. So where do libraries fit in this picture? You guys do a great job of sort of keeping things civil, keeping things trustworthy, keeping things respectful for the world. So this slide is the Gallup organization asks a battery of questions that they've asked over a long period of time. Do you trust these institutions to do the right thing or are you confident that they do the right thing most of the time? And you'll see at the top of the list is the U.S. military. The military and libraries and firefighters are the three main organizations and groups that have bucked against the broad national trend of decline in institutions to do the right thing. Lots of other institutions, the church, businesses, journalists, banks, have seen sharp declines, particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, in trust. The military has actually bucked that trend. Librarians have held their own. Firefighters have held their own. And we asked a slightly different question, but it's not too terribly incomparable. We asked how important are libraries to their communities, and 63% said they are a great deal important to their communities, and another 28% said that they are somewhat important to their communities. So again, it's a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison, but you guys stand up really well against this tide of cynicism and criticism and distrust that people have in lots of other organizations. That's a really precious place to be in this culture, and my buddy Nicole, who's just been a pal forever, and I love her to death. I might have even suggested her to Jane as a possible speaker here. Has been at the center of this conversation for so long and has been such a teacher of libraries and other anchor institutions in communities about how they can sort of fight against the tide and be sort of sanctuaries in a world where distrust in institutions is particularly high. In some data that we collected a couple of years ago, we asked about people's trust in sources of information, and libraries and healthcare providers were at the top of the list for those who enjoyed the most trust. You enjoyed more trust than even information that's passed along from family and friends, information that comes from government sources, information that comes from both local and national news organizations, information that comes from financial institutions, and information on social media is like, think of social media as the technological equivalent of Congress. Nobody trusts it. And nobody likes to think good things about it, although they depend on it in certain ways, and they obviously, in the case of social media, are pretty active on it, at least folks are. So again, librarians have this special carved out place of trust that it feels like you can leverage. I mean, certainly if your own value proposition to your communities is anchored in trust, but it feels like librarians could be at the center of community conversations that have people talking to each other in different, better ways. One of the things that I'm working on right at the moment is that we did a very special focused survey on trust both in institutions and among people. And then we asked an open-ended question in this survey. How might we solve the problem especially of interpersonal trust? And people were saying it happens in communities. It started in communities. The first, tribes were formed by people trusting each other and banding together to keep the saber-toothed tigers away and the other tribes away. But trust is now a very localized thing, and its best sort of place to find its starting role in growing trust in the wider world is to have community conversations, community activities that have the flavor of doing something together. Even if you're on different teams, even if you have completely different points of view, there's a very palpable hope Americans have that community-based activities can be a solution to the bigger problems of trust we have in society. And it just strikes me as sort of obvious and logical that libraries are places that could be conveners of those, hosts of those, narrators of those, modelers of how good, solid, wonderful, respectful, trustworthy conversations can take place. So here's the story now in facts, and of course the interplay between facts and trust is just enormously deep and bonded, and many of the problems that I've just discussed in trust come from the fact that people don't have the same view about facts anymore and don't rely on the same sources as they did anymore. So just before Election Day in 2016, we asked a question: do you think that the supporters of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump at least share the same facts? They've got different solutions for how to deal with problems of society. Do they share the same facts, or they disagree about the basic facts and what policies can come from? 81% said they disagree about the facts. It's just a recipe for balkanization and pulling people apart and anchoring this sort of level of toxic distrust that's in the culture. Right after the election, when fake news then became the hashtag of the moment, we asked people about fake information, and we asked whether completely made-up news, what has it done to the culture? And 2/3 of Americans said it's caused a great deal of confusion about the basic facts related to current events, and another quarter of people said it's caused some confusion. The striking number that we got out of that survey was, remember, this is a phone survey. So the people are answering questions on the phone, and so sometimes there's a social desirability bias. People want to answer the correct way rather than the way that they really feel. 23% of people admitted to passing along fake news and fake misinformation. 16% said they shared political news that they later found out was made up. So at the time they shared it, they didn't know that it was made up. But 14% said they passed along material that they knew was fake at the moment that they passed it along. And so anyone who said yes to either one of those questions, and some people said yes to both, ends up being a quarter of the population. We've re-asked that question and are going to put out some information probably very late spring or very early summer. These numbers have moved around, and to some degree, people are now fessing up even more to passing along fake information, although they are less likely to say they did it on purpose, they were sort of faked into it, or they had different motives for sharing it. But it's striking that the phenomenon itself, as much as people condemn it, people are part of the story. Related to it. Then we did this really fun piece of work. We rather than looking at people and fake information, just flat, cold, stone, fake information, which is really hard to fact check and ask people what they believe, we marched people in a survey through an exercise where we gave them 5 statements of fact and 5 statements of opinion, and we asked them to determine which was a fact and which was an opinion. And a lot of people kind of got the facts right, or a majority got facts right. Even in the bottom one there, the statement of fact was immigrants who are in the United States illegally have some rights under the Constitution, and 54% agreed with that. But you can see that there are a lot of people who think facts are opinions, and a lot of people who think opinions are facts. And it sorts out just the way that lots of other experimental research has suggested it would sort out. If it's an opinion that agrees with my point of view, I call it a fact. If it's a fact that disagrees with my point of view, I call it an opinion. And both sides are guilty of the cognitive mistake that is being made in that proposition. So we're all sort of motivated reasoners. We're all looking for information that confirms things that we want. And it takes a very special person to even sort of admit to the factual basis of things that don't agree with their point of view. So in addition to looking at sort of question by question whether people got them right, we tried to figure out how many people got the whole batch of questions right or how many they got right. Only a quarter of Americans could get all 5 factual statements right. And 35% got the opinion statements right. So minorities of Americans could actually figure out in basic cases of political information what was separating fact from opinion. Some of the differentiators, as people were looking at this, is people who are actually self-described as being more highly politically aware were better at getting facts right and opinions right than people who had less political awareness or who were less tuned into political life. Kind of makes sense. If you're paying attention more, you probably get things more correct. Their digital savviness, again, sort of self-reported digital savviness, those who were more digital savvy got more facts right and more opinions right than people who said that I'm not as comfortable with these technologies as I wish I could be. The people who trusted the news media were much more likely to get facts right and opinions right than those who have distrust in the media. So you could see how that relationship would hold up. If you're not sure what you're reading or viewing every day in a news organization, you'll potentially struggle to figure out fact from opinion. And news interest was also a bit of a predictor, although not nearly as strongly, at least on the factual side. What was striking here is that while everybody wants to complain about millennials, they do a lot of things better than their elders do. Millennials were more likely, or people under 50 actually were more likely to get the factual statements right and more likely to get the opinion statements right. This lines up with a whole lot of other things that we have discovered over the years, where millennials are not these sad, isolated, narcissistic, factually illiterate folks that they are. They're actually tuned in to the culture in many ways more than their elders are. The other fun one that we've got is it's specifically on the question about privacy. Millennials are way more tuned in to what's going on and how to at least manage their reputations. They're much more vigilant about what's being said about them and much more vigilant about pictures about them and much more vigilant about sort of every time that there's a disturbance in the force when privacy settings are changed, particularly on Facebook or Twitter. They're more likely to be tuned into that and to respond to that than their elders are. Part of that is just tech savviness, but again, it's a real interesting pushback against the narrative about millennials. By the way, Pew has now sort of officially declared, so it must be true, that Gen Z exists and is now entering public life. So the last millennial was born on December 31st, 1996, according to us. And the first Gen Z person was born on January 1, 1997. And so the first wave of Gen Z members is now certainly in college, and many of them are entering the workforce. And we're beginning to, we've got a whole bunch of material on this now, and it's super relevant to library users. What's interesting about them is that they look in their sort of political and values profiles, they look a lot like millennials do. So there isn't a generational break that we're yet picking up, although tons of Gen Z people are still living at home. So their politics in some respects and their values reflects their parents' values. But their tech profile is all mobile, right? And they are way more tuned into this sort of a constant screen life, even than their elder siblings are. So we're having a lot to say about those kind of things. One of the most striking things that we found is that the misinformation problem now is a personal problem. 26% of Americans, a quarter of them, have had false information about them posted online, and it's almost half of those who are ages 18 to 29. So there's not just a sort of cultural, political dimension to fake news and misinformation. It's about me. and my stuff. And again, sort of millennials are especially tuned into the reputational damage that can occur when misinformation about them has been propagated, and so that's why we get especially high readings when the misinformation relates to their character or reputation. But again, young people, a fifth of them have had misinformation posted about their relationship or sexual history, and their political views. Political views are not nearly as sort of central to this story as they are to other kinds of things. But it's just a really striking thing that particularly for young people now, they see the misinformation problem as something that is an intimate problem, not just a sort of out there cultural issue. This is kind of a weird slide, but it speaks to where facts stand in the universe now. We gathered this massive database of congressional statements, their Facebook posts, their press releases, their speeches on the House floor, their statements in committee meetings and things like that. And we then looked at the Facebook version of that, and what we found was that the more indignant the tone of their post, the more angry, the more incendiary, the more accusatory it was, the more likes, comments, and shares it got. So the attention economy rewards toxic behavior, and the less civil stuff, and the more angry stuff. And this is a little peekaboo in the world of Congress, but it's true. There are other researchers who have shown the same thing. The angrier stuff is, the more engagement it gets. These are the metrics of social media and the metrics of the attention economy. And so it's hard to push back against that with reasoned debate and with facts that are opposed to the thing that's been posted, because you're fighting against an emotional current, and emotions are way more important as people judge what's coming into their lives than the actual truth is. So yay, libraries again. As we've asked questions about where libraries sit in the information pantheon of people, that libraries sit in one of the highest attributes that people give to libraries is they help people decide what information they can trust. A lot of people also say they help people when they seek health information. It's a really important dimension of people's lives. It's highly sensitive, highly important information, and they give librarians a lot of credit for helping them on that. Help people learn how to use technologies. That's just a testament to the fact that you've rebranded yourselves as tech hubs. Even if the architects say don't be digital, the fact of the matter is your reputation now is very much aligned with the switch from analog to digital as the culture has shifted. You're good for helping people learn about local events and resources that are available in the community. You're good at helping find out about opportunities for volunteerism. You're good at helping people find jobs and job training. And you're good at helping people when a natural disaster or major problem strikes their community. And if you isolate among our respondents people who have actually had natural disasters in that community, all those numbers shift right. People understand how valuable libraries are in a host of ways when the worst happens in their community. So this is like the money slide for librarians in an era where facts are at issue and trust is at stake in things. You guys sort of across the board, you sweep the table. You guys do well at every dimension we ask for. We also have asked questions over time. How well, if at all, the local libraries serve the learning and educational needs of their community, and 75% say very well, pretty well, and it's the same thing when we asked about serving the learning and education needs of you and your families. Now, it's interesting as we unpack that, the people who are sort of high-end information omnivores. They've got a lot of technology in their life. They love the library. They're working in knowledge-related jobs. Again, sort of the people who are most tuned into what the challenges are of this society are the people who say way more than the average that you serve the learning needs of your communities and you serve the learning needs of them and their families. Now, the final leg of the stool relates to democracy itself. In a way, the precursor story is how people's trust is being reallocated and reconfigured in the digital age, and how that ties to the challenges people have with information, facts, and misinformation. And these are the institutions that are supposed to serve the trust needs of people, to mediate and to regulate what's going on in the broader society, and to do it on an evidence-based basis. So how are we doing on that stuff? The role of partisan polarization now is the biggest story about why things aren't going too terribly well. Again, sort of goes back to that media slide that I showed you, that people go to media sources that agree with their point of view, or that they think will give them the information that's relevant to their ideology and their partisan interests. That is an outcome of this story that we call the Magic Mountains inside our shop. In 1994, we began to ask a series of political and social values questions of respondents to our surveys. And in 1994, the lines in the middle show where the median Democrat and median Republican stood on these issues. So almost all Democrats had some conservative views. A lot of Republicans had some liberal views. And you see in the darkest blue area there were lots of conservative Democrats and lots of liberal Republicans, or they had mixed views when you sort of scored them on an ideology scale. Same question in 2004, not too much difference. Actually, the median line got even closer, so that there was a bit of convergence, particularly post 9/11 and the onset of the Iraq War. By 2017, there are hardly any people who are conservative Democrats or liberal Republicans. If you look at the darker blue line there, that is a small number of people who have sort of mixed views or are actually in the other camp related to their party. So we've had ideological and partisan purification of our parties. If you're liberal, you're now a Democrat. If you're conservative, you're now a Republican. That's not a common state throughout American history, and it certainly wasn't the modern experience until very recently. Among those who this is just another way to show you that 3% of Republicans are consistently liberal, and like 6% of Democrats are consistently conservative. So it's a way to more starkly identify why there is such a small overlap in people's values, or why they're not necessarily mixed values anymore. They're ideologically more consistent than they used to be. Here's when we asked about presidential approval, a standard political polling question for places like Pew. You see in the Trump era, the divergence now is broader than it has ever been, and it's an artifact. I mean, people have always thought if you were of one party and your party held the presidency, you were more likely to approve of the presidency. That's standard forever kinds of social psychology and political psychology, and Pew's captured that in a way. But the striking thing about the Trump era, there are actually two striking things. One is the partisan divide is greater than it's ever been, and it's been consistent throughout. I mean, we were, I think, the first to sort of say that the Trump's base just doesn't budge. No matter what happens in the day-to-day news cycle, or what happens in the wider world, or any of that kind of stuff, there's a real solidity to the share of the population that is supporting him. By the same token, there's a real solidity to the share of the population that is unalterably opposed to him, no matter what he does. But that's the way the information and trust decisions that people are making are now being played out in the public arena. When we wanted to look at the impact on democracy, one of the really clever things that was done not by my unit, but at the unit that focuses on politics at Pew, we began to unpack the idea, because we weren't sure anymore how people thought about sort of the broad institutions that were designed to serve them and to serve democratic ends. So we asked a series of questions about how important are these attributes to the well-functioning of our democracy. And then we asked the same question, how well are we doing on them? So how important are they? How well are we doing on them? And the gap is enormous almost across the board. We've never asked questions like this before because the stakes and the sort of cultural conversations weren't so much rooted here, so I don't have trend data on this. You have to presume that 20 years ago it wasn't as stark as it is now, but the gap between how important it is for a well-functioning democracy and how well we're doing on it, it sort of is just so striking. So people don't like the gridlock they see in Washington, or lots of people don't like it. So people are in despair of Republicans and Democrats working together. But they are also in despair that elected officials are held to account for serious consequences if they do misconduct. Campaign contributions do not lead to greater political influence. The government is open and transparent. The number of people who are in despair of that is incredibly high. It's 30% of the population say that we're doing well on it. So 70% say we're not doing well on it. News organizations do not favor one party. Judges are not influenced by political parties. Rights and freedoms of all people are respected, and the tone of political debate is respectful. Then, just to continue on, I'm not going to read all of this, but the only things that we are not sort of living up to our sense of what the ideal is and what the importance is relates to people are free to peacefully protest. There isn't a gap to speak of there. And military leadership does not publicly support a party. There's a little bit of a gap there, but it's not nearly as large as it is across the board. So there's this palpable sense in the American public that democracy is not working. And the sort of core ideals that undergird it are not being honored. This is another slide that just shows how starkly now political partisanship flavors people's reaction to the world. In social science research of the kind that we do, forever, things like people's race, their religious affiliation, and more importantly, even their religious attendance. If you go to church often, you are a different kind of person, and predictably different kind of person than someone who goes to church less often or doesn't go at all. Age and gender, those were important demographic attributes that flavored people's judgments about all sorts of things in the world. In this case, we're measuring them on those values questions. Now, people's party identification is 3 times or more important as a predictor for how people process information and how people think about the world. So almost by default now, huge chunks of the population assess information by the valence of whether does it help my team or not. And I'm going to believe it if it does, and I'm going to disbelieve it if it doesn't. So it's an incredibly challenging environment to have facts break through and to have institutions in service of those facts trying to make policy judgments. There's a thing that political scientists now talk about when they look at data like this. They call it affective partisanship. It essentially means how much does this stuff enter into people's day-to-day lives? Does it, it's one thing to judge public information and public policy making through a partisan lens. It's another thing to think that the people who are on my team, compared with the people who are on the other team, are virtuous, wonderful, great, as opposed to the people on the other side. And there's just tons of data now in Pew findings, as well as other findings, that people don't just disagree with people on the other side, they hate them. They hold them in contempt. They think that they are bad for the culture. They think that their policy ideas would ruin the nation, not just sort of be mistakes, but would bring ruination to the nation. So part of that shows up when we ask whether you have a favorable or unfavorable view about parties. More and more people now, compared to 1994, on both sides, so they have a very unfavorable view about the other side. When we asked about personal attributes, Republicans are more likely to say Democrats are closed-minded than open-minded, immoral compared to moral, lazy compared to hardworking, dishonest compared to honest, unintelligent versus intelligent, and the same gaps exist on Democrats judging Republicans. So it's not just the wrongness of the political ideas of the other side, it's literally the nature of the people on the other side themselves as being at issue. And after the 2018 election, we just asked a simple question: how do you think things are going to go after this? And more people than not expected that things will get worse. Even after, if they're Democrats, their team had a pretty good night. They still think that things are going to get worse, and compared to other off-year elections, it was a much higher number than in the past. And here's how this shows up horribly, not only in judgments about democratic institutions and things like that, but we've asked this question forever, sort of, who do you have confidence in when it comes to policy making, or making political decisions? And so we asked about parties, and we asked about elected officials, and we asked about a variety of groups. And the one group that did well, no matter what, since we started doing this in 1997, was the wisdom of the American people. So other groups might screw it up, but at least the American people are smart enough, and we trust their political wisdom. That number collapsed in 2015. And now more people think that, that the American people have no political wisdom, or can't be relied upon for their political wisdom, which is essentially a vote of no confidence in the whole democratic idea. This is a portrait of a culture in despair, and just last week we put out new data when we asked people to think about the future. And by large margins, people said in the next 30 years, the country will be less important in the world than it is now. The gap between rich and poor will grow in the next 30 years, that the country will be more politically divided. 2/3 said that, compared with about a quarter who said different. And they are universally worried about their political leaders to address these issues. So again, it's a portrait of a society that is in despair and is quite discouraged about not only the prospects now, but the prospects on the future. So I'm going to give you a big charge. You have to save this country. It's not too dramatic an ask. I mean, this is not this is a sick society in many respects, according to our data. And so combining together all the insights that we have gotten from people about what they need to navigate this newer, tougher, more toxic world, and just to function in getting the best information they can to make the right decisions they can, or to make the right choices that they need to make. These are the things that they're asking for, and it's like the playbook for librarians, or it's like the profile and playbook of librarians. So they want smart allies, and they understand that they can't often navigate these places alone, that they need literacy skills, that they need second opinion skills. And many Americans now say that the more diverse, and they understand that the more diverse the inputs are, the smarter the group is, and the smarter I can be when I'm looking for advice and counsel on things. Librarians are like the best coaches of all of diversity and inclusion and orchestrating conversations that have multiple voices in them. So check box number 1, you guys sit at the top of the likely allies that people are looking for as they try to work in this world. They are looking for improved curators. People just think the world is full of noise now. And they are looking for guidance now in assembling the best stuff, the most useful stuff, the most interesting stuff, the most enriching stuff. And again, it's been so interesting to watch how librarians, in my sense, in 20 years ago when we first started this work, you were a little bit more diffident about your capacities in this area than you now are. I think you've read your communities correctly, that they are looking for this kind of curation. And I think many libraries now are sort of intentionally getting into the business of sort of, this is what we're reading. This is what's good. Here are ways to be discerning about what's true and false. And so checkbox number 2 for you. In many respects, what people are now saying that matters to them, or at least a benchmarking element of trust for them, is authenticity. And authenticity often comes from just interpersonal reactions, or sort of authentic conversation, even if it's at a distance or even with strangers. And librarians are sort of the walking embodiment of authenticity. I mean, you are so deeply trusted, and you are so well respected that, and it comes from you, first of all, being the face of the information community in their midst, but also just sort of well-meaning, nice people. I mean, librarians are self-selecting for kind of those attributes, and so that's a big asset in your favor. Obviously, transparency is a big part of it, and librarians sort of all instinctively, and certainly by your training, understand how important, first of all, your own capacity to figure out where stuff comes from and figure out the sort of markers of trust and truth that come with that. But you're also great modelers and teachers for others on that, so you check that box off too. They are looking for people who will give them more confidence that they can grow. I've showed slides, I think here in the past, that there are big chunk of Americans consider themselves lifelong learners, and that you are at the center of that story. Library users in particular self-define that way, and especially since the 2008 recession, where people had to really take stock about, are my skills good enough? Is my company going to survive? Is even my industry going to get wiped out and things? That you guys are coaches and modelers of a learning mindset, and a way for people to sort of do assessments of where they stand in the world, so you're good at that. They want just-in-time help in decision-making, and I know librarians are maybe somewhat reluctant to help people sort of make the final call, and probably that shouldn't be the line of work that you're in. But there are ways now, especially with the immediacy of information in their lives, that they are hoping that at the decision-making point, or at the opinion formation point, that someone will help, be a reality check on that someone will help them walk through the choices they're making and the decisions they're making. And so just-in-time help is now sort of a job requirement for lots of libraries. They obviously still want lots more tech use and information literacy. Nicole made the case for that, I think. Closed the deal on making the case for that. She has devoted a lot of her life to making this point. But people now still see libraries as a way for them to upgrade their literacy, their capacity to learn about new things. The whole petting zoo, tech petting zoo idea that you guys have promulgated for years is sort of an embedded part of people's judgments about you. And they want protection in a whole host of ways. They don't want to obviously be fooled by fake information. But they're also, when they talk about this to us, they're also talking about the complexity of privacy in this day and age. And how do I navigate this in a way that I don't get hammered by the profiling that's done of me, by the third-party uses of the data that I've kind of willingly given to other people. And so in a way that probably might even feel uncomfortable to a lot of librarians, they are looking for real hard and fast guidance about how to be smarter citizens and digital citizens in particular. And the library is sort of a default place now in people's minds as they're thinking about that need in their life. So this is the slide I always close with. Many of you might recognize it. But it's a big ask that you guys save the culture. You're well positioned to do it. You've got the right instincts to do it. You've got the right skills and knowledge to do it. And people are depending on you to do it. So it's a daunting task. But you've kind of been up to it already in the digital age. And there's a way to be hunting your way through these new roles that might be required of you from your communities. You'll make mistakes probably along the way. But people are so hungry for this special sauce that you guys deliver to your communities and your lives that I, speaking on behalf of the tens of thousands of people we talk to every year, please do a good job at this. Thank you very much.